Shalom and welcome to a new live stream from Me Israel for Fred. MIF is the largest non-religious, non-partisan pro-Israel group in Europe, defending Israel in Norway, Denmark, Sweden and Iceland. So usually we communicate in the Scandinavian languages, but in our video archive on YouTube and Facebook you will also find numerous interesting interviews and lectures in English. So please have a look and make sure you subscribe and get the notifications of future live streams. And the like button is not far away from you. Just click it. Yeah, you did. You clicked it. Great. Thanks. I like you too. In this live stream, I will be joined by David Weinberg. He is a columnist in Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayam, and he is a senior fellow at the Kohelet Forum and in Israel's Defense and Security Forum. Weinberg is well known by members of MIF from previous visits on speaking tours in Scandinavia. So please use this opportunity to ask Weinberg questions in the comment section and engage with us in our discussion. So, Shalom David.
Shalom from Jerusalem.
Good to see you.
Great to be here with you, Conrad, and your listeners.
And how is life in Israel these days?
Well, it's holiday time, Passover for me, Easter and Ramadan for others, a time for family gatherings and celebrations, a little bit of downtime from work. It's spring, so this is a forward-looking period.
Yeah. And I remember the first time you visited MIF in Norway. I think it was in 9 years ago, maybe. You said Israel was winning. Is Israel still winning?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Without question. And I'm glad you asked me that because it's important for you to know. It's important for our friends and colleagues who are on this broadcast with us to know that despite the renewal or the most recent wave of Palestinian terrorism, despite the possibility of renewed broader scale military conflict with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, Israelis are not depressed. Israelis are not crawling into their shells or hiding in bunkers most of the time. I think most Israelis still feel that yes, we are winning, and that the regional strategic architecture is changing in ways that are good for Israel, that are good for the West, and that hold real promise for the future. What we all know as the Abraham Accords are a breakthrough, perhaps not moving as fastly as we once might have hoped, but nevertheless, these are real breakthroughs, and Israel is stronger than ever. So yes, I believe Israel is still winning. Great.
And you mentioned there several of the issues that we will discuss in this interview. And again, if the viewers have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask the questions and put it in the comment section. But within the last few weeks, Israel has experienced 4 terrorist attacks that claimed 14 lives, and then of course unrest also in other incidents. Do you think that these terrorist attacks come as a result of incitement from Palestinian Authority?
I do think that, and I'll elaborate on that, but there's a broader context as well. The Palestinian leadership remains recalcitrant. It remains stuck in the wars of past. Palestinians seem to be the last Arab populace in this part of the region that is prepared to understand and accept the permanence of Israel and come to compromise terms with it. And as a result, the Palestinians have been left out of regional diplomacy in recent years. They're stuck with a calcified and anachronistic leadership, a corrupt leadership, both in the West Bank, in Gaza, a radical leadership that fights against any and every opportunity for peace, that's been fiercely opposed to the recent openings between Israel and Gulf states, and as a result, they've been left behind. And the Palestinians are now acting up in order to try to get some attention and remind the world that they're still around and they have demands that are yet to be met. And they're immature. And frank way of doing so is through the use of violence. There's no question. I mean, there's no question in anybody's mind that Hamas remains committed to the destruction of Israel. Hamas controls the Gaza Strip. It has fought several wars with Israel in recent years, and every once in a while it feels the need to launch some rockets into Israel to remind everybody they're still there. If you remember, there were wild riots in Jerusalem last summer, sparked when Hamas fired missiles into Jerusalem. They had various excuses for doing so, and that led to a large-scale Israeli military operation against Hamas in Gaza. And they may be getting ready to do much the same now. It is also true, as you hinted, that the Palestinian Authority leadership based in Ramallah in the West Bank continues to spread terrible lies, blood libels about Israel. They've upped their rhetoric about Jews storming Al-Aqsa, the mosque on the Temple Mount, and slaughtering Muslims at prayer, neither of which is true. Even the overheated Jordanian prime minister made some terrible remarks this week, suggesting that Israel was attacking the Muslim shrines on the Temple Mount. And unfortunately, Islamic violence in Jerusalem and in and around the Temple Mount has become almost the new status quo. And there is a dangerous big lie that is now being spread as if Israel is responsible and purposely provoking peaceful Palestinians at prayer in Jerusalem. And that's not true. There is only one side, the Arab side, that has purposely escalated violence in Jerusalem and defiantly defiled Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, over the past 20 years. It's the Palestinians that have turned Al-Aqsa Mosque and the entire Temple Mount Plaza into Armageddon, into an armed base of operations, and almost an extraterritorial headquarters for the propagation of big lies against Israel. And we're now facing a situation where this has become an almost daily occurrence. Jews flocking to the Western Wall at the foot of the Temple Mount for Passover prayers have been attacked, have been stoned, have been firebombed, buses have been destroyed. The pictures you see on your television screens of Israeli troops operating on the Temple Mount come about only as the result of armed mobs of Palestinians using the shrine, that's the Dome of the Rock, and the mosque, that's the Al-Aqsa building, as bases for attacking visitors to the Temple Mount and visitors to the Western Wall. Israel has no interest in disrupting peaceful prayer by Muslims on the Temple Mount. And in fact, once the Israeli police this week managed to run the ruffians and the marauders and the rioters off the Temple Mount, 50 to 80,000 Palestinian Arabs celebrated their Ramadan festivities each day up on the Temple Mount. And if you read the right newspapers, you can see pictures of families up on the Temple Mount, eating their iftar meals and celebrating their Ramadan holidays as they should be.
Yeah. Do you think they, like, if you are a religious Muslim and you want peace and you want to come there for prayer, don't you think that they are in a way thankful for the Israeli police clearing the thugs away?
I'm sure you're right. Unfortunately, these people don't have a political voice.
Yeah.
Palestinian Authority is a dictatorial entity that sees no need to give expression to the will of the broader public. And I really do believe that the vast majority of Palestinians who live in this area, as well as Israeli Arabs who live within Israel, seek accommodation, integration, well-being, and a good life alongside Israelis. But we still have significant radical actors, radical Islamic actors, and terrorist groups that seek to roil the waters and spark conflagrations. There's also internal rivalries within the Arab and Israel world, Arab and Palestinian world, with Hamas seeking to gain ascendancy in the Palestinian community and the Jordanians seeking to gain ascendancy over the Turks. There's a whole whirlwind of politics around the Temple Mount and Israel. And Israel has a difficult time navigating these dangerous politics and yet keeping the holy sites open and accessible for Jews and Muslims alike.
We have got 2 questions from viewers so far. Nigel, he's watching us from Belgium. Hello, Nigel. He asked, who might be the elusive Palestinian partner for peace in your view? Is there a Palestinian partner for peace somewhere out there?
As they say in Arabic, inshallah, or in Hebrew, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, may that be God's will. I cannot name a name for you at the moment, and even if I did, it would probably be the kiss of death for him, because anyone viewed as a moderate interlocutor by Israelis would probably lose legitimacy in his own community. There are some senior Palestinian figures who work closely with Israel on a day-to-day basis to prevent the Hamas takeover of the West Bank, to prevent the extension of Hamas's takeover in Gaza from growing to the West Bank, to Judea and Samaria. And some of the people could be reasonable interlocutors for the future in an era after the era of Mahmoud Abbas. One has to assume that Mahmoud Abbas will move on sooner or later. He is 85, 86 and not well, and increasingly isolated within his own community. But I don't have a Palestinian Messiah to point to at the moment whom I could say with certainty would sue for a true compromise peace with Israel. And that, of course, is part of the tragedy for them, for the Palestinians, as well as for Israel.
Yeah. You wrote a column this week about Western leaders' reactions to the tensions on the Temple Mount. I want us to discuss more about that. But first, Rike from Denmark, she asked, do you think there will be an escalation of the situation like we saw last year during Guardian of the Walls?
I don't know, but I hope not. I think that Hamas itself is still deterred by the punishing damage Israel inflicted on Hamas leaders, their military installations, their weapons stockpiles, their underground terrorist attack tunnels, and so on. And that ought to keep Hamas at bay and deter them from starting another first-go round with Israel. But again, there are different factions within Hamas. There's other factions in Gaza as well. And the situation is somewhat of a tinderbox. Bad decision-making on Hamas's part could lead, even against their will, to an explosion. The larger question is not really the Palestinians in Gaza, but where is Hezbollah? Hezbollah, of course, is the Iranian-backed, fully Iranian-funded, large military and terrorist force based in Lebanon. Essentially, Hezbollah controls the entire southern Lebanon and much of central Lebanon and the Beirut environs. And Hezbollah is, a pull the trigger Iranian tool for deterring or warring with Israel. And given the fact that the Israeli-Iranian confrontation seems to be nearing, Hezbollah in Lebanon could be told by the Iranians to unleash their firepower. I say that the Israeli-Iranian confrontation seems to be moving closer because of what appears to be Western capitulation, Biden administration capitulation to the Iranians with regard to their nuclear military efforts. We all know that the administration is seeking to re-enter the 1985 agreement reached by the Obama administration with the Iranians. In Israel's view, the agreement back then was bad, and the agreement they're now talking about is even worse. And neither the agreement then nor the current agreement being discussed would appear to truly put an end to the Iranian nuclear military effort. We certainly know that Iran's terrorist muckraking around the region has not abated. In fact, it has accelerated with Iranian attacks not only on Israeli targets, but on Saudi targets, Emirati targets, Egyptian targets, and American targets in Iraq. So it's not beyond the realm of the possible that a more direct shooting war between Israel and Iran is coming, and that, of course, would involve a conflagration on Israel's borders as well. So in some ways, as difficult as it is, Palestinian terrorist attacks in Bnei Brak, in Hadera, in Jerusalem are painful, but they're the lesser evil of Israel's problems.
Yeah. Do you think that the current government coalition in Israel is ready to take on Iran? Like, would it even fracture the government more if there would be some action against the nuclear program in Iran? Or would it bring more unity in Israel?
I'm glad to discuss Israeli politics with you, Conrad, and let's say that we'll come back to your question in a moment or two. I want to go back for a moment to something you mentioned beforehand, which is the reaction of Western leaders.
Sure.
To the violence, the Arab-instigated violence that we've seen in Jerusalem over the last 2 weeks. I am infuriated, absolutely infuriated by the calls of Western leaders upon Israel to de-escalate, to ensure the status quo on the Temple Mount and respect the sanctity of Muslim holy sites. Often this is accompanied by all sorts of veiled references to incursions or provocative actions by Israeli police or excessive force, quote unquote, employed by police to disperse peaceful Arab worshipers. And this is an inversion of truth. It's a perversion that involves blaming Israel for the violence on the Temple Mount, and it's absolutely galling. To use a well-known Israeli Jewish word, it's total chutzpah. The plain facts are that the so-called status quo on the Temple Mount has long been dead. It's been killed and violated in recent years by radical Palestinian and Islamic actors who have turned the Mount, as I said earlier, into a base of attack against Israel. And to the point where Palestinian terrorists have even smuggled weaponry onto the Temple Mount, and after shooting Israeli officers dead, fled into the shrines on the Mount. Mm-hmm. And Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, has stoked a broad-scale campaign of delegitimization of Israel, against the authenticity of Israel's historic rights in Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount in particular. And it bothers me tremendously that gullible and some not so gullible Western leaders amplify Abbas's big lies by blabbering about Israel's so-called unprovoked actions against peaceful Arab worshipers, and that's not the case. Even responsible and well-meaning Western statesmen like the Canadian foreign minister or the American Secretary of State have repeated these mumbo-jumbo lines about calling on all sides to de-escalate and respect the status of the holy sites. Israel does not need to be reminded to de-escalate or to respect the holy sites, the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem. There's only one side that has repeatedly violated the status quo in Jerusalem, and that has purposely escalated the violence, and that is the Arab side. And therefore, these, balanced calls on all sides to de-escalate are truly galling.
We are going to discuss also what Israel can learn from the war in Ukraine, and one of our viewers, Henrik, he says Israel is one of very few democratic nations who has no sanctions against Russia or Russian oligarchs. Prime Minister Bennett has still not condemned the Russian invasion, he claims, and could this have an impact on the support of Israel from Europe and or the US? So maybe you should fact check and comment.
Yes. So first of all, your viewer, your listener's question is an important question, and I'm glad he asked it because it does give me the opportunity to correct the factual record and provide some perspective on the way in which Israel has handled the war in Europe, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So first of all, the simple fact is that Israel has repeatedly condemned Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Israel has voted at the UN for the international resolutions condemning the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Israel voted for the UN, the resolution at the UN Council on Human Rights to condemn the Russian invasion, and as a result of which Russia withdrew its participation in the UN CHR in Geneva. And President Putin is in fact very angry with Israel for joining the Western condemnations of the invasion. Your questioner is correct that Israel has additional national interests that it needs to take into account, and therefore Israel has refrained from providing weaponry to either side in this conflict. It has been one of the leading countries in the world to provide humanitarian assistance and aid to the Ukrainian people. Israel is the first country in the world to set up a field hospital on the Polish-Ukrainian border, which is treating thousands of refugees and everyday Ukrainians with medical aid. Israel and Jewish organizations around the world have provided over $50 million of worth of medical and humanitarian assistance to Jews and non-Jews, caught up in the conflict in the Ukraine, in the Russian invasion, and barbaric bombardment of the Ukraine. But because Israel has a Russian Air Force on its doorstep in Syria, because Russia has the ability to interfere with Israel's security operations against forward Iranian troops and radical Islamic militias in Syria and Lebanon, Israel needs to be cautious. And I think Israel's handled the situation as best possible. I don't think there can be any doubt about Israel's alliance with the West in condemning the Russian invasion and providing humanitarian support to the Ukrainian people. But it also has its own interests to take care of here in the region. The fact is that the first leader that Ukrainian President Zelensky turned to in seeking to broker talks between the Ukraine and Russia that might bring about an end to this war was the Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett has been a key interlocutor, a mediator between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The fact that Israel has the trust, the respect of both leaderships, both the Ukrainian and the Russian leaderships, is a good thing, good for the world and of course good for Israel. And we can all hope that perhaps Israel's mediation efforts, which are still underway, can bring about at least a long-term ceasefire, if not a longer-term conciliation in the Ukraine. So you have to be careful about jumping to criticize Israel in the current situation. I think Israel has both made its position, its moral position, very clear, as well as explained its strategic interests.
A few weeks ago, we had Norwegian senior journalist. She was asked about Israel's role in the negotiations, and she said that, I'm paraphrasing her, that Israel is probably not so well suited because of they are themselves in conflict with the Palestinians and they are occupying. But she thought Turkey would be better. Turkey would be better suited to lead the negotiations.
Anyone,
but maybe Turkey is an occupier as well. Maybe maybe they are in a conflict.
Anybody who thinks that Turkey is under Erdogan, President Erdogan is a responsible and reliable actor, needs to do a little bit more homework. Number one, Turkey is one of the biggest repressors of human rights in our world. There are more journalists, judges, generals, and academics in jail in Turkey today than any other country in the world, including communist China. Erdogan has created an Islamist dictatorship that is a severe violator of his own people's human rights. And the Turkish military occupies a significant swath of territory across northern Syria that they have no intention of ever leaving. Surprise, surprise that nobody in the world mentions that. And that, of course, is because Turkey is a member of NATO, and NATO has no mechanisms for throwing one of its members out. You can't push Turkey out of NATO, and doing so would be very problematic. But looking to Erdogan to be a reasonable, reliable, and responsible actor in international affairs or in Middle East affairs is a mistake. Israel is currently seeking a conciliation with Turkey. Erdogan has been on a vicious anti-Israel and even anti-Semitic campaign for over a decade now. Because the Turkish state is currently weak, its economy is in the dumps, and Erdogan has isolated himself in the region. He's now looking for some sort of calm in Israel-Turkish relations, and Israel's not opposed to that. But Israel has, price to place on this. Most directly that Erdogan should stop supporting Hamas. He literally provides funds for Hamas's terrorist operations against Israel and hosts some of the Hamas terrorist leadership in Turkey. But coming back to the Ukraine, anybody who looks to Turkey is making a big mistake. A democracy like Israel that is now the linchpin of a new security architecture in this region, where the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Moroccans, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and some other actors quietly are aligned with Israel, seeking stability in the region and creating a new discourse of peace. That's the wave of the future. That is the security alliance that holds hope for the Middle East. The fact is that these countries see Israel as a force for prosperity, for stability, for security. And it's not surprising that Zelensky in Ukraine has turned to Israel in this regard as well.
What do you think that Israel can, apart from what you already mentioned, is there any lessons that Israel can draw from Russia's invasion?
Yes, there are, and they're unfortunate lessons. Because to a great extent, the Ukraine has been abandoned by the West. Of course, everybody expresses support for Ukrainian independence and applauds President Zelensky and the bravery of his people in standing up to superior Russian military firepower. And everybody's rushed in with, bits and pieces of humanitarian aid, and even a few countries have, sent some artillery pieces, usually antiquated stuff, but something symbolic to help the Ukrainians fight. But the real lesson from this is that even your closest friends aren't necessarily going to come to your aid when it's crunch time. And if you're not a member of NATO, you might get sympathy from the West when you're attacked, but not necessarily concrete assistance. And for Israel, the lesson is, and it's a lesson that Israel has always known, but only now is being reinforced, is that Israel must always be ready to defend itself by itself. And again, Israel knows that it must be ready to defend itself by itself, with support, with sympathy, hopefully, from like-minded Western countries, but never to be dependent on their coming to Israel's direct military assistance. And in fact, Israel has never requested that any Western army fight for Israel. Israel, its people, my sons and son-in-laws, know that they need to be ready to defend this country. And the unfortunate lesson that you have to draw from the current conflict in the Ukraine is that sympathy may be coming, but concrete military assistance not necessarily. And that's it's a sad lesson. It's this lesson that, as I said, Israel has long known, but is undoubtedly reinforced by what we've seen over the last 60 days.
And also maybe not give up your nuclear weapons for international guarantees.
To the extent that Israel might have nuclear weapons, according to foreign reports, yes, that would be an additional lesson.
Yeah. So many viewers send their love and greetings. We have viewers from Denmark and from the Faroe Islands and several places across Norway. Let's use the last few minutes to talk more about the Abraham Accords and the blossoming relations to Arab countries. Last year, I think, you told us about this a match made in heaven, Israel's relations to the Emirates. And have you been back there since? and how is the relation going?
Okay, thank you for the question, because it's an important topic. It's an important topic because in Western progressive circles and extreme liberal circles, the Abraham Accords have not been embraced warmly. They're actually dismissed, and that's a tragedy. And we need to find ways to get the Biden administration and European governments to adopt a more enthusiastic approach to expanding Arab and Islamic peace with Israel through the context of the Abraham Accords. Now, as I told you earlier, the Abraham Accords have transformed the strategic architecture of the Middle East, with Israel moving into an offensive posture that is buttressed, an offensive posture against Iran, that is buttressed by a network of alliances with key Arab countries. And Israel is becoming the center of a new international security order, an emerging alliance structure that is aimed at combating belligerent actors in the Middle East. And that is a framework that spans from the United States and Europe to North Africa, Saudi Arabia, its Persian Gulf allies, and all the way across to India. I believe that the warm friendships and the security partnerships that are developing between Israel and the Gulf states are real. They're long-term. They represent an Arab interest as well as an Israeli interest. And I could go on for the next hour giving you concrete examples of the moderate discourse and real people-to-people ties that have emerged over the last 2 years. Now, unfortunately for parts of the political left and the usual anti-Israel mobs, it's difficult to exult, to be happy about the Abraham Accords, because it means swallowing the fact that Israel is demonstrably a force for good, for knowledge, for prosperity, for stability in the Middle East. After all, that's the reason that the Abraham Accord countries are bandwagoning with Israel. And it's hard for them to accept the Abraham Accords as a result, because they're also a blunt refutation, a slap into the face to the ongoing Palestinian campaign to deny and criminalize the Jewish people's historic rights in Israel. And therefore, there is a nasty, bitter, ideological, distorted take on Israeli and American goals among some of the left. They assert that the Abraham Accords were nothing more than a Trump-tainted gimmick or a attempt by the Netanyahu governments to do an end run around the Palestinians. They're not an authentic breakthrough for peace and security in the Middle East. These assertions are absolutely false. Therefore, we need to find ways to bring the progressive side of the political world in Europe and America into closer understanding and to strengthening the Abraham Accords, not just pay lip service to them. Some people have pointed out that this past week have tried to say that the Accords are weak. The fact is that the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans have harshly condemned Israel for the rioting in and around the Temple Mount over the last week. And yes, that is unfortunate. There are, undercurrents even in these countries that are still haven't come to terms with Israel. But I believe that the anchor accords for peace and the main leadership in these countries is still solidly on board. And in fact, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the special role that Israel has played in preventing escalation to all-out war between Russia and NATO, it is time for the Biden administration and others to adopt a more positive approach to expanding Arab-Islamic peace accords with Israel. In fact, I think the Abraham Accords could and should be rebranded as a spur to peace with the Palestinians. And that progressives ought to connect with this benefit, because the accords can mean more willingness, certainly of Israelis, to compromise with the Palestinians, and these Arab countries can help the Palestinians become better disposed towards real compromises for peace with Israel. The only real question I have is a tactical question. And you hinted at this earlier. Israel is once again undergoing some internal political turmoil. The Bennett-Lapid-Gantz government has lost its parliamentary majority in Knesset and is quite unstable. The government could fall about a month from now, once Knesset comes back into session after the Passover vacation break. And that could throw Israel into another 3 to 6 months of election turmoil. That's not good for Israel. It's not good for regional peacemaking. And I hope that another round of elections, which would be Israel's 4th or 5th election over the past 3 years, I hope that can be avoided.
Yeah, it will be, but how can it be avoided? Like, would the coalition be able to tempt some right-wing or ultra-orthodox representatives to support them from the outside, or?
Perhaps. It has been my assumption all along that the longer this government, the Bennett-Lapid-Gantz coalition government, survives, the greater the likelihood that one of the ultra-Orthodox Israeli Jewish parties would join its ranks, stabilizing the government. That has not happened up until now. And with the defection of one of Naftali Bennett's own party members, that could be maybe increasingly unlikely at this point. I don't have a clear scenario to suggest to you, which would bring about long-term stability for this government. But I think the government has a good chance of, at least on national security matters, maintaining the very clear line. This is an important point. Israel's national security and foreign policy priorities have remained stable in the transition from 10 years of Netanyahu-led governments to the Bennett government. And that's a testament to the fact that when it comes to issues of war and peace and security, there is a great deal of consensus in Israel today. The country is not divided on right-wing, left-wing lines the way it may have been 20 or 30 years ago in the early days of the Oslo Accords. Most Israelis today agree on the major foreign policy and security issues. Israelis know that the government's main challenge is in confronting Iranian regional hegemonic ambitions and nuclear ambitions. They know that the government's main challenge in security affairs is maintaining the integrity of Israel's borders. And there isn't a lot of difference in this regard between Netanyahu government policy and Bennett government policy. And that's important. That's an important signal to the world. Don't think that it was only Netanyahu who had this obsession with Iran. It's not true. It's very clear to Israelis that the Iranian hegemonic threat is real and will have to be dealt with, along with Iran's, Islamic radical proxies and allies in the region, of which there are many. So I think, at least on national security issues, the Bennett government, for as long as it lasts, can make a clear policy. Clearly, because it has an Islamic Arab party, the Ra'am party, in its coalition, it needs to be more careful than ever in Jerusalem. Perhaps too careful, in my view. The government has been acting with too much restraint and ought to more directly assert Israeli and Jewish national rights in Jerusalem and in the holy sites in Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount. But to a certain extent, Naftali Bennett is circumscribed by his coalition partners. Not an easy situation. Unfortunately, I don't see any solution coming out of another round of elections either. Maybe end up with the same sort of hung political results, even if Israel were to go to elections, let's say, in September.
Yeah.
And therefore, I don't think anybody has any reason to be particularly happy or to crow about the collapse, if it happens, of the Bennett government.
David, thanks a lot for joining us. Very informative as always. People are thanking you for the good update, and we even have a viewer from Greece today. She's very happy to follow our page and watch your very interesting events.
So this is my opportunity. So this is my opportunity to thank you, Conrad, your organization, and all of our listeners and viewers today for their concern, for their love, for their support. You should know that Israelis truly appreciate the understanding, love, and support of well-meaning individuals and governments around the world. Not everybody, as you know, in this world is too friendly to Israel or Jews in this century. So for those of you who are engaged, both in praying for Israel and in politically supporting Israel, thank you. It gives me additional strength and encouragement. So thank you.
Yeah. All the best. Stay strong. Bye-bye.
Well.
Grunnen til at jeg støtter Israel og er blitt med i MIF, det er fordi at informasjonen vi får i norsk media er så ensidig. Og vi får ikke fram den hele sannheten om den konflikten som er i området.
Jeg er medlem av MIF for å prøve å få en bedre forståelse av det reelle bildet av Israel og hvordan det israelske folk ser på konflikten i Midtøsten, og for å få et litt mer helhetlig bilde av det.
Jo, jeg er medlem av MIF fordi jeg mener at Israel og jødene har rett til sitt land. Det er givende, og du blir jo ofte utfordret på det, men det som også er utrolig bra med MIF er at de gjør et veldig godt grunnarbeid med å hente god informasjon, så argumentene er selvfølgelig på vår side. Aldri vært viktigere å stå opp for Israel.
Det er viktig. Det er Midtøstens eneste reelle demokrati.
I Norge er bildet på Israel så forvrengt at den jobben MIF gjør er helt nødvendig.
Jeg er veldig glad i MIF og har blitt mer og mer engasjert, og jeg er stolt over det arbeidet MIF gjør. Jeg synes at MIF taler til alle, og så er det jo selvfølgelig politisk uavhengig og religiøst uavhengig, så MIF favner jo bredt.
Det var jo egentlig bestefar som begynte med det, siden han syntes det var så fælt hvordan Norge behandlet jøder under andre verdenskrig. Så jeg støtter vel egentlig, for jeg føler det blir så feil fremstilt i media i Norge.
Det gir et fellesskap og et tankefellesskap og et sosialt fellesskap, der du kan få utforske situasjonen på nye måter, og du kan få inn perspektiver og holdninger, og gjerne se ting som du ikke ser så mange andre veier. Og du får, etter min mening, et mer helhetlig syn på konflikten.
Til alle dere unge der ute som har lurt på det, så er det bare å melde seg inn.